So Elijah, he heard the earthquake, but he didn't go outside. He saw the fire, but he didn't go outside. It wasn't until he heard the wind. It was because he knew God's voice. He knew what God's voice sounded like. He knew, there was an earthquake, but he knew, oh, that's nature. But he said, but that's not God. He said there was fire. He showed up in the wilderness with fire. He said, yeah, but that's not God. But then when he heard the small voice, when he heard the wind, some version says still small voice, he was familiar with it. So he went outside to meet with God. So he was familiar with God's voice. And so if we're familiar with God's voice, we want to become familiar with God's voice to the point where, the earthquakes don't shake us when there's earthquakes. When the fires come, we're not shaking. We're not shaking because we're close to God. We're familiar with His voice. When people threaten us, we're not moved by it. When the opinions of other people have negative opinions, we're not moved by it because we're not by it. And so we want to, when we have the negative self-talk telling us this and that we're not moved by it. And so we need to get closer to God. And so some people are saying, well, that's great for Elijah, but God doesn't talk to me like that. That's great for Elijah, but God hasn't been talking to me like that. And so, the question is, what are you doing about that? What are you doing about that? James 4:8 says, come closer to God and He will come closer to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. So are you pursuing God? Are you actively, intentionally trying to, hear from God? And I know that, I grew up in a church, a Baptist church, and people talked about hearing God. And I would hear that. And I was 40 years old. I'd been in the youth choir, I'd been in the male chorus, I was a junior deacon, I was in the usher board, I was lead singer, but I didn't hear from God. I knew people said it. I read the Bible, and sometimes God would say, sometimes I would turn to the Bible and point to a verse and say, God, tell me what to do, and point to a verse. and sometimes the preacher would say something that's like, oh, that's speaking right to me. But I didn't, so I heard from God in certain ways, but it's like, but that doesn't sound like what people are talking about. So I went on an intentional search to try to get this other level of hearing God. And so and I wouldn't suggest the search that I went, I went and I was, looking, I went to, some of the charismatic churches where they're prophesying and other churches where they're calling the Holy Spirit down on you. And I was trying to get this closer relationship. I heard that there's more to the religion than what I'm experiencing. And so it wasn't until, I had my regular Bible study at ALCF, which they gave us an exercise. Okay, every day I want you for a certain time, 15 minutes to just sit there and pray. And so, I did that, and then I expanded it. Then I would worship and I would pray. Sometimes I would worship, sometimes I would pray, sometimes I would read the Bible, just whatever I felt like. But I had a set time, and I would do it and then through that period, I felt, I started to hear more. I was like a thought would come into my mind, and I started to hear, and I eventually developed a relationship where it's like, okay, now I hear God's voice and what God's voice says to me, and so I developed a relationship. And so I would ask you to pursue God, to intentionally take a pursuit to get to know God better, to get a deeper relationship with God, and that deeper relationship with God will get you to the point will counteract the inner thoughts, will counteract the inner critics, will counteract the thoughts that you're having. When I get into the presence of God, it gives me a peace. It gives me a peace. It changes my perspective. Stuff that I thought was an issue that I was worried about all day, I'm not thinking about it anymore, and it just goes away. So I would suggest that you intentionally pursue a relationship with God. Chase after God and draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. So let's walk in the way. Let's seek the truth and live the life.